I don't know if it's news, media, propaganda. It's just the use of the use of fatal force incidents, in community. We just had one on I-65, which was a mental health crisis, um, but a high profile one, that you were just a part of, the Daniel Hambrick case. Um, Many folks, specifically, I would say in the black community here, felt that that was mishandled. Um, can you share your thoughts on that process um, with that case, and maybe give us some insight that you haven't voiced in community, haven't hasn't heard quite from you in detail.
Okay. Um, Daniel Hambrick was shot and killed by a police officer named Andrew Delkey. When it first happened, right, I called in the TBI to do the investigation. But even while the TBI was taking control of the scene, the Metro Nashville Police Department was taking a picture of a gun and tweeting that out, that here's a picture of the gun, describing Daniel Hambrick as the gunman. And when we got the video from MDHA that night, we could see this chase. It was a traffic stop. The worst thing that could happen is a traffic stop that escalates into a shooting. It was a traffic stop that Daniel Hambrick had run from the police, and that he had a gun in his hand as he was running. The MDHA video, as he continues to run, he runs past a tree. This is late July, had leaves on it. And so the last 7 or 8 seconds of Daniel Hambrick's life, you could not see, right? In the shooting, you could not see. And so you start to get the reports of what the police officer was saying. The police officer was saying that he, was threatened by Daniel Hambrick, and so he had to do this shooting. And so when I met with the TBI, I said, see if there's any other cameras, and then get me that. And sure enough, they found one on a high school that was a block away, and not as high quality of an image as MDHA, but you could see what happened because it was a different angle. And so on that Sunday following the Thursday night shooting, I got to see that video for the first time. And I thought the video was clear, right? I mean, yeah, it was a little bit grainy, right? Yeah, it was like 3 frames per second. But clearly Daniel Hambrick was just running. He was running away. Was he obeying the police commands to stop, drop the gun? No, but he was just running. And the officer stopped and shot him in the back. And I saw that, and it was clear to me that it looked to me like either a first-degree murder or a second-degree murder. That wanted to make sure we got all the investigation done by the TBI. But I thought it was clear that a crime had been committed. But I also knew that when we attempted to charge the officer, that there were going to be some problems with that case, right? No question Daniel Hambrick had a gun. No question the officer was yelling at him to stop and to drop the gun. I also knew that there had never been a case in Nashville where an officer was charged with first or second degree murder, right? And that there hadn't been many cases around the country where an officer had been even charged, and even fewer where the officer was convicted. But I thought that when I see a crime, right, I tell every assistant in my office, you have to believe beyond a reasonable doubt that the crime was committed, or else you cannot go forward. Mm-hmm. And you have to believe that a rational jury can convict based upon these facts. And I said, look, we might be the underdogs on this, but we'll be right going forward. And so I said, well, you know what? We're going to charge him, and we're going to charge him by a warrant. I had seen too many cases where people had just given a case to a grand jury, and the grand jury had failed to indict Breonna Taylor. That prosecutor didn't even give him the opportunity to charge with a murder. Michael Brown in St. Louis, right? Well, the district attorney comes out, well, this and this and this, and so the grand jury didn't indict, but nobody was present for that. So I said, let's do it by warrant, where everything is transparent. And so we had a first application to a magistrate. The magistrate refused to give a warrant. And so we had to go to a general sessions judge and got a general sessions judge to sign the warrant. And then we had a preliminary hearing, and Judge Melissa Blackburn bound the case over to the grand jury. And then we presented it to the grand jury and were able to successfully get an indictment in the case. But all along, his attorneys had said, we're not pleading anything, right? Nobody's ever been convicted when the person had a gun in their hand, and they were right. And in Tennessee, the rules are that if the allegation is by the officer self-defense, number one, you get a kind of a super self-defense charge, even stronger than a stand your ground, the stand your ground law that got Trayvon Martin's killer off in Florida. It's a super self-defense for police officers. Also under Tennessee law, even if the officer doesn't know who they're chasing, then the criminal record of the person they shot can come into evidence. And I don't want to talk too much about that, but knowing that we were going to have a jury that was going to be probably 10 white, 2 black, maybe 9 white, 2 black, 9 white, 3 black. I mean, I know kind of some attitudes that folks might bring into that jury box, some implicit biases maybe. And so I knew we were the underdogs as we were going forward. But I also knew that I thought that we were right, and by golly, we were gonna fully intended to try that case. I was not going to dismiss that case. But also knew that however the case worked out, it was going to be triggering for a lot of folks. Right? There were a lot of folks who said that I was wrong to ever charge a police officer. But if it's an unjustified killing, an officer needs to know that they can be charged. But there's a lot of folks that were very upset about that. On the other hand, folks, especially in the black community, I knew that there was a chance that that what was going to happen whenever this case resolved, whether it was a conviction, whether it was a hung jury, which meant no sanction against the officer, or whether it was an acquittal, that was going to be a triggering moment for folks with all of their emotions, because folks do have legitimate concerns about what's going to happen to their kids if they ever get pulled over by a police officer, and it's different in the white community and the black community. It just is.
Right.
When I turned 16, my parents talked to me and says, if you ever get pulled over, yes sir and no sir to the officer, and do whatever they tell you to do. Right? I was at a function at Pearl Cone, and we were having different groups, 10, 15 tables of 10 people, and we were talking about different topics. And one of the topics, and I was at a table with a number of folks, in the topics of what do you say to your 16-year-old? And I can remember a pastor that was at the table, African-American pastor, who said, when my son turned 16, I did not know if I should give him the talk.
Right. And
ultimately, I decided I had to, because I had to make sure that he was as protected as possible. And the talk, as he described it, was keep your hands on the steering wheel at all times. Right? Whenever the police officer gives you an instruction, move very slowly. Right? Make sure that they know before you move exactly how you were going to move, because I don't want you to be shot, son. Right? And he was breaking down in tears in front of strangers as he shared this. We have implicit bias training every year in my office. And there was a woman in my office who shared a conversation about the talk when her son had turned 16. And she described it as, when my son turned 16, all his life he'd been a happy-go-lucky kid. He loved everybody and everybody loved him. But I had to give him the talk the day he got his driver's license. Right. She said, and I could see a little bit of the light go out in his eyes, right? There should not be two different kinds of talks that are given, right? Right. We've got to get to a place where folks aren't afraid, where no one in our community is afraid of the police. But when you see these incidents happen over and over and over again, of course, folks have black folks in Nashville give that talk. And here's a situation where for the second time in the last 8 years, it was a traffic stop that escalated to somebody being shot and killed. All right, so we're ready. We're getting ready for trial. We're a week away from starting to pick the jury in the trial. All right, and ultimately, anytime that you get close to a trial, there's at least a little bit of discussion. I thought the chances of them pleading guilty were close to zero as far as pleading guilty to anything. Right. Ultimately, about a week before the trial, a few days before the trial was supposed to start, we reached an agreement that was as follows. He would actually plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter, right, which is a knowing killing under a heat of passion. Right? He would give up on his self-defense claims and any claims of it being a justified shooting. He would become a convicted felon. He would never be able to be a police officer again. He would never again be able to have a gun and a badge on the street. He'd never be able to have a gun again. He would admit that what he did was wrong and that he was not justified, and he would go to jail for a 3-year sentence, which, if he gets all of his behavioral credits, he may be able to get done as quickly as 18 months. It'll probably be somewhere between 18 and 21 months that he'll actually do in jail. When I made that deal, I knew that Daniel Hambrick's life was worth way more than 3 years.
Okay.
Right? If I was a juror, I would have convicted of first-degree murder. But I wasn't going to be the jury. I was just going to be the lawyer in front of the jury, and I had to get all 12 people to agree unanimously that he was guilty of second-degree murder or first-degree murder in order to achieve that conviction. When I took office in 2014, the police department investigated itself on any officer-involved shooting. So, of course, there were never any officer-involved shootings that turned into a prosecution.
Right.
I said, we're going to bring in the TBI every time. I said to the chief, you have to sign this MOU, which he did not want to do, right? But ultimately he did, and so officer-involved shootings, chief signed it.
Chief Anderson, right?
Chief Anderson,
Okay.
the TBI and the DA's office. So shooting happens, as soon as the scene is secure, they let me know. I call in the TBI, MNPD just secures the perimeter, and the TBI does all the investigation. But that wasn't enough. I've worked with 4 mayors to get body cams on every police officer, so we know it's not just what the police officer's report says happened,
Right.
because that might not be exactly what happened, right? So we can see the body cam. We know, right, exactly what the officer was seeing at the time the officer decided to discharge his or her weapon.
Right.
But an independent investigation and a body cam don't change police behavior unless the criminal justice system has demonstrated that the officer in an unjustified shooting can be charged, convicted, and incarcerated, right? I could not, and the odds were that was either going to be a not guilty or a hung jury where the officer's not accountable, right? Well, yeah, we could have tried it again, but we'd have still had 12-person jury that had to find unanimously.
Right.
I knew that this was a situation where no other jurisdiction in the whole country has ever convicted somebody when the person who was shot had a gun in their hand. And I knew it was the first time that Nashville had ever convicted an officer on something that would put him in jail, right? So, I made this decision. Yeah, it had some people very angry. It had some people very hurt. It had some people who thought, well, gee, Glenn, we put our trust in you, and you had our back. You were going forward against this police officer. But at the end of the day, what I want is I want no more mothers to have to grieve for a child who was shot by a police officer after a traffic stop. And so you have to have that deterrence to make sure that we change the police training, we change the police behavior. No police officer wants to be in jail for even 3 minutes. And we have to change the attitude from, well, I shoot because I can, to I'm only going to shoot if I absolutely have to.
Speaking of mothers, what was Mrs. Hambrick's reaction, or what was that conversation like when you told her, like, hey, this is a decision that we're going to go forth with?
Right. I'd been meeting with Ms. Hambrick for 3 years, right? Many, many times, right? I knew that she wanted Andrew Delkey to be in prison for the rest of his life. I knew that. And I knew that she had gone through a civil process where she was suing. And in a civil lawsuit where you're arguing about money, then she has to give permission before the thing gets settled because it's her money, right? In a criminal case, I represent the people of the state of Tennessee. I represent the people of Nashville. I try to do what's in the best interest of the people of Nashville. And we make sure that victims have input and we know kind of what they want, what their expectations are, but they don't necessarily get veto power over a decision. Mm-hmm. Right? When I met with Ms. Hambrick, she was upset. By the time that we actually had the plea the next day, she was very upset in the courtroom. Now, she did call me Glenn when she was yelling. Now, she was very angry, right? But she called me Glenn, which demonstrated in my mind that, this is not something where she hadn't seen me for 3 years and all of a sudden I'm doing this without having taken her concerns into account. And my heart goes out to her. She lost her only son, right? She's a grieving mother. This is, and her son's life is worth more than 3 years, right? I mean, and if I could be judge, jury, TDOC all in one person, yeah, for sure, this would have had a different result. But in this case, with those facts, likelihood of a hung jury, percentage chance of an acquittal, the facts of this case that were not nearly as egregious as some of the cases where folks have had the case dismissed. This was, in my mind, the best outcome in order to make sure that we had the best chance going forward that no one else was going to be the victim of an unjustified shooting after a traffic stop.